welcome, and settle in. Let the place where you are become a little quieter, even if the world outside is still busy. If you can, let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw soften. Let your hands rest, open and unhurried. Take one slow breath in and let it out, as if you are letting go of a small, ordinary weight. Nothing you need to solve tonight. Nothing you need to prove. The day has had its turn, and now it can step back. If you are listening with tired eyes from a screen-lit life, you are not alone. Modern days can feel like a river of updates, demands, and comparisons, always moving, always asking for more. Tonight, we will follow 3 gentle, true-style recovery stories. Ordinary people who began to feel worn down and then found small, humane ways to come back to themselves. No dramatic transformations, no grand declarations. Just quiet choices that made breathing space. As you listen, you can let the details drift through you like a soft lamp glow. You do not have to remember anything. If sleep comes, let it come. If wakefulness stays for a while, that is also okay. You can simply rest here, listening, while the stories carry you. In a moment, we will begin with someone early in their career, caught in an anxious loop of upskilling panic and online comparison, and the simple relief of removing pressure feeds and rebuilding mornings. And when that story settles, we will move to a freelancer who chased every trend until their days had no edges, and how a single offer, a single platform, and an evening shutdown ritual made room for peace. Then, quietly, we will visit a student who worked and studied under the weight of family expectations and found steadiness by asking for help and planning each day with 2 lists. For now, let your breathing find its own calm rhythm, like waves arriving and leaving without hurry. Jin was 24 and still new enough to the office that the lobby guard greeted them with a look of mild curiosity, as if confirming each morning that they belonged there. The company was mid-sized, the kind of place with glass meeting rooms and an open pantry where coffee was always brewing. Jin's desk sat near a window, and on clear days they could see sunlight slide across the neighboring buildings like a slow hand. The job itself was not cruel. It was ordinary, full of small tasks that needed care, arranging files, writing notes, cleaning up drafts, making sure a project stayed on track. Jin liked the steadiness of it. They liked having a reason to wake up and a badge that opened doors. Then the talk began to change. In meetings, people used a new set of words with bright, careful smiles. AI tools, automation, models, copilots, upskilling. A senior colleague gave a presentation about the future and ended with an encouraging line about staying competitive. Everyone nodded. Jin nodded too, but inside they felt the floor tilt. The message sounded friendly, yet Jin heard the sharp edge behind it: keep up or be left behind. Jin did what they had always done when they felt afraid of falling behind. They tried to outrun the feeling. After work, they opened their laptop again, They watched tutorials, read threads, saved links. One tab became 10, and 10 became a whole row of tiny rectangles, each one a promise that if Jin clicked it, they would finally feel safe. On the train, they scrolled short videos of people speaking fast about new skills. At lunch, they refreshed feeds that were designed to keep them hungry. The more Jin consumed, the larger the gap seemed between what they knew and what they imagined everyone else knew. Comparison crept into everything. A coworker mentioned a new tool in passing, and Jin spent the evening searching for it. A friend joked about learning something over the weekend, and Jin laughed, then stayed up late trying to do the same. Even the language in the headlines felt like a drumbeat. Jin would tell themselves they were only being responsible, but their body understood it differently. Their shoulders rose, their jaw tightened, their sleep became thin and interrupted, as if the mind refused to clock out. At work, Jin's focus began to fray. They would start a task, then remember a post, then check a notification, then forget what they had meant to do. The day was full of small self-made interruptions. At night, Jin lay in the dark and watched their thoughts line up like a queue. Learn this, try that, prove something, hurry. The tiredness was real, but the quiet never arrived. One evening, Jin stood in their small kitchen, waiting for water to heat. The apartment was dim. The world reduced to the hum of the refrigerator and the soft city sounds through the window. Their phone lit up with another alert from a channel that always sounded urgent. The headline promised a truth that would make Jin anxious and then offer a way to fix it, for a price, in time, if Jin clicked right now. Jin reached for the phone, then paused. In the dark screen, they caught a glimpse of their own face. Tired and tight. It was an ordinary moment with no drama in it, just a sudden, plain thought. This is not helping. The kettle clicked off. Jin poured hot water into a mug and felt the warmth gather in their hands. They set the phone down without opening the alert. It felt small, almost nothing. And yet their chest loosened a fraction, as if the body had been waiting for permission. The next morning, Jin began with removal. Still in the quiet early light, they opened their email subscriptions and started unsubscribing from the loudest voices. They muted the chat channels that had turned into a stream of articles and jokes about being replaced. They turned off most notifications. They moved a few apps off the home screen, not as punishment, but as a boundary. Jin told themselves that if something was truly important, it could arrive through a person, not through a badge that demanded attention. Then Jin made one gentle decision about mornings. The first hour would not belong to panic. At night, they placed the phone across the room and left a notebook by the bed. In the morning, when the alarm sounded, Jin had to stand up to turn it off. They opened the curtains and let their eyes rest on the pale sky. They drank water. They ate something simple. They did not fill the kitchen with voices from a video. They let the sounds be small and honest. In the notebook, Jin wrote 3 lines for the day. 1 task to complete at work. 1 small act of care, like a short walk or a proper lunch away from the screen. And 1 sentence that sounded almost too gentle to be useful. You can learn at a human pace. Jin did not have to believe it fully. Writing it was enough. On the train, Jin sometimes kept their earbuds in their pocket and let the commute be what it was. Doors opening, footsteps, the low rhythm of the city. With fewer inputs, the mind had less to wrestle. Jin began arriving at the office with a little more of themselves intact. A few days into this new approach, Jin did something that felt quietly brave. During a check-in, they asked their manager what the team truly needed from them in the next few months and what would count as progress. The manager answered plainly. They did not demand mastery of everything. They named 1 area where a tool could help with repetitive work and suggested blocking a short daily time slot for learning during office hours. They offered to cover the cost of training. Hearing this, Jin felt a not ease. The future was still uncertain, but the shape of Jin's next step was suddenly smaller, and therefore possible. Jin began keeping the learning small on purpose. 30 minutes, a timer, 1 lesson. When the timer ended, Jin stopped, even if they felt they should keep going. They returned to their actual work. They let the day be 1 day, not a contest where they had to win the future before sunset. The comparison habit did not vanish overnight. Some evenings, Jin's hand moved toward the phone without thinking. Sometimes they searched for a tool just because someone had mentioned it. When Jin noticed themselves slipping into the old loop, they tried not to scold themselves. They wrote the fear down instead, in plain words, as if setting a heavy bag on the floor. Then, they wrote the next small action they could take, and the time they would take it. A fear with a boundary felt less like a wave and more like a cloud passing. Weeks went by. Jin's mornings became steadier. They began to notice simple things again. The taste of tea, the feel of clean sheets, the relief of finishing a task without breaking concentration to chase a headline. They still learned, but the learning no longer came with the same sharpness. It was tied to use, to the work in front of them, not to a fantasy of catching up with the entire internet. One Saturday, Jin left home without a podcast playing and walked for a while under a quiet sky. They passed a small shop rolling up its shutters. Someone watered plants on a balcony. For long minutes, Jin's mind did not mention the future at all. The calm was not dramatic, it was simply present. And it reminded Jin that they were not built to live inside an alarm. That night, Jin prepared for sleep with the same simple kindness. They had begun giving their mornings. They set the phone away. They washed their mug. They left tomorrow's clothes folded on a chair, not to be efficient, but to make the morning easier. In bed, the mind offered a few anxious thoughts, but with fewer pressure feeds to latch onto, the thoughts did not have much fuel. Jinn breathed, slow and steady, and felt the day soften. Somewhere outside, the city kept moving. Jinn did not have to keep pace in the dark. A quiet morning waited ahead, like a small lantern, and Jinn let themselves drift toward it. Not far from Jinn's office, in another part of the same city, Ara worked at a desk that faced a wall. Ara was a freelancer, which meant the work had freedom in it, and also a strange kind of endlessness. There was no lobby guard, no closing announcement, no clear moment when the day ended. The desk was in a corner of a small apartment, close enough to the kitchen that Ara could reach the kettle without standing fully up. In the early days, this setup had felt like a small victory. Ara had imagined quiet mornings, deep focus, long afternoons with light on the floor. Instead, the weeks became a chase. Ara's work was skilled and real. They could write, design, edit, shape things into clarity. Clients liked the way Ara made messy ideas sound simple. The trouble was not a lack of ability. The trouble was that Ara kept listening to the loudest voices online, and the loudest voices never stayed in one place. Every few days, a new trend rose, like a flare, a new format, a new platform, a new tool everyone claimed you had to master immediately. Ara would see a post that said the old way was dead, and something inside them would clamp down. They would pivot their website, rewrite their bio, adjust their pricing, change their offer. They would start a course, then abandon it halfway when someone said a different course was better. They would chase attention the way you chase a bus, running faster and faster while the street keeps stretching. The workday, in theory, started in the morning. In practice, it started the moment Ara's eyes opened. They reached for the phone to check messages and found themselves reading metrics. A number went up, and Ara felt a brief lift. A number went down, and Ara felt a drop in the stomach that lasted for hours. It was as if their sense of steadiness had been tied to a dashboard. Clients arrived through different paths, a message here, a comment there, an introduction through a friend of a friend. Ara said yes to almost everything because yes felt safer than choosing. 1 month, they offered website copy. The next month, they offered brand strategy. Then they added short video scripts. Then they added a workshop. The offers multiplied like tabs in a browser. Each offer came with its own marketing plan, its own language, its own promise. Ara's days filled with beginning and beginning and beginning, and very little finishing. At night, the laptop stayed open. The cursor blinked in a document while Ara ate dinner. Notifications lit the screen while Ara brushed their teeth. There was always one more reply that could be sent quickly, one more idea that might keep a client happy, one more trend to research before it passed. Even when Ara tried to rest, the mind kept scanning for what was next. Sleep arrived late, and often with the phone face up beside the pillow, like a small lighthouse that never turned off. It was not that Ara loved the chase. It was that Ara feared what would happen if they stopped. In the quiet, questions appeared. Was their work still valuable? Were they already behind? Would clients vanish if Ara did not keep up with the newest thing? One afternoon, after a week of chasing 3 different directions, Ara realized they had not stepped outside in 2 days. The light through the window had shifted, and the air in the room felt stale, as if it had been used up by the constant thinking. Ara stood, slowly, and went to a neighborhood cafe for a change of scene. The cafe was small and steady. It smelled of bread and warm milk. People sat with books and quiet conversations. No one seemed to be optimizing anything. Ara ordered a drink and sat by the window, watching a person sweep the sidewalk in slow arcs. A friend happened to be there, someone Ara had not seen in a while. They talked about ordinary things at first: the weather, a movie, a shared memory from years ago. Then, the friend asked, in a simple tone, what Ara was working on these days. Ara tried to answer and felt their words tangle. They listed a few projects, then corrected themselves, then added something else. Even as they spoke, Ara could hear how scattered it sounded. The friend listened without judgment and then asked a second question, quieter and more pointed. If Ara could only do one kind of work for the next 6 months, what would it be? Ara laughed, as if the question were impossible, and then the laughter faded. In the silence after it, Ara realized they did have an answer. They had an answer they had been avoiding because it would mean choosing. Choosing meant letting other possibilities go, and letting possibilities go felt risky. But sitting by the cafe window, watching the slow sweep of the broom, Ara noticed something else. The current way of living also had a cost. It was the cost of never resting, never finishing, never feeling done. Ara went home that day and did not open a new course. They opened a blank document and wrote one sentence about what they actually wanted to offer. Not everything they could do. Not the shape that would please an algorithm. Just the work they could do well, repeatedly, without turning into a frantic person. Ara chose one offer: to help small businesses and creators write clear, calm words for their websites and emails. The kind of words that sound like a human being speaking. It was a specific lane. It was not flashy. It was honest. Then Ara chose one platform, one place online where they would show up consistently. Not 5. Not 10. 1. A simple page where they could post short pieces of writing and examples, and where people could find them without Ara having to perform everywhere at once. Ara told themselves that this was not a permanent rule. It was a season of focus. It was an experiment in steadiness. The next part was the part Ara had never learned how to do, ending the day. In an office, the world tells you when to stop. Lights dim, people pack up, elevators fill. as a freelancer. Ara had been carrying the day on their back like a sack that never got set down. So, Ara created a small ritual, the way shopkeepers close a door and turn a sign. At the end of each workday, Ara began to do the same sequence. They wrote a short note about what they had finished, even if it was not perfect. They listed the next tiny step for tomorrow, so the mind would not have to hold it all night. They replied to any urgent messages, and then they set a boundary after a certain hour. They would not answer. Ara prepared a simple message that said they would respond the next business day, and they used it without apology. Then Ara closed the laptop fully, not just half-lidded, but shut. They cleared the desk of cups and scraps of paper. They washed the mug in warm water and watched it come clean. They turned off the bright overhead light and switched on a smaller lamp. Sometimes they opened a window for a few minutes and let fresh air move through the room. The ritual was not dramatic. It was repetitive and plain, which is part of what made it work. It taught Ara's body, over and over, that the day had an ending. At first, the ritual felt uncomfortable. After closing the laptop, Ara would feel the urge to open it again, just to check one more thing. They would think of an idea and want to write it down immediately. They would wonder if a client had replied. The mind had been trained to stay on alert. So Ara added one more piece, a gentle place for those thoughts to go. They kept a small notebook on the desk, and when the urge came, they wrote the thought down, then left it there, like leaving a note on the counter of a closed shop. The thought would be waiting in the morning. Ara did not have to carry it into the night. Over the next weeks, something quiet began to happen. With one offer, Ara's website became simpler. Their messages to clients became clearer. They stopped rewriting their identity every time the internet got excited. With one platform, the pressure to be everywhere loosened. Ara's work began to attract people who wanted the exact thing Ara was offering, which meant fewer mismatched projects and fewer exhausting negotiations. The metrics still existed, but Ara looked at them less often. Some days the numbers were higher, some days lower, and Ara practiced letting them be weather instead of prophecy. The shutdown ritual became a bridge, a way to cross from work mind to human mind. Ara started having evenings again, not as an empty space to fill with scrolling, but as a real part of life. On one particular evening, rain tapped lightly against the window. Ara finished a draft, sent it, wrote tomorrow's first step in the notebook, and then closed the laptop. They washed the mug, dried it, and set it upside down on the towel. The simple actions had a softness to them, like smoothing a sheet. Ara sat on the floor for a moment with their back against the couch and listened to the rain. The mind offered a question about what was trending, then, finding no open door, let the question drift away. The room felt larger when it was not packed with urgency. Later, When Ara turned off the lamp and lay down, the phone was not beside the pillow. It was charging across the room, out of reach. Ara's body, which had been trained to stay ready, began to learn a new pattern: work can end. The world can keep moving without you. In the dark, the rain kept its steady rhythm, and Ara let that rhythm become a kind of lullaby, the sound of a day being gently closed. While Ara was learning to close the day, Hana was living inside days that never seemed to close at all. Hana was a student and also a worker, which meant the calendar was always full and the gaps between obligations were thin. Some mornings began in a classroom with fluorescent lights and printed slides. Some afternoons were spent on a part-time shift, standing for hours, smiling when customers were tired. Some evenings were given to gig work, quick deliveries and quick messages, because rent and tuition did not pause just because Hana was exhausted. At home, there was family. Not a dramatic story, just the ordinary weight of being needed. A younger sibling needed rides and help with homework. A parent worked long hours and came home drained. There were errands, groceries, appointments, small domestic tasks that piled up like laundry. Hana loved their family, and that love made it easy to say yes even when the body was saying no. Hana's phone calendar looked like a mosaic, blocks of color pressed tightly together. If one thing ran late, everything after it tipped. Hana began to live with the constant feeling of being behind. Even on days when they were doing an impossible amount, they carried a list in their head that never stopped updating. In class, they thought about work. At work, they thought about class. On the bus, they tried to answer messages from everyone at once. The tiredness showed up in small ways. Hana would open a textbook and read the same paragraph 3 times without taking it in. They would forget to reply to a message and then feel guilty for hours. They would plan to sleep early, then lie down and feel the mind racing through unfinished tasks, as if the brain were trying to protect them by rehearsing everything. Sleep came in patches, shallow and easily broken. Hana tried to fix it by tightening their grip. They downloaded planning apps. They watched videos about productivity. They made longer lists, then felt overwhelmed by the lists. The more they tried to control every detail, the more their days felt like a room with too much furniture. One week, a small crack appeared that changed everything, not because it was dramatic, but because it revealed the truth. Hana missed a deadline. It was not a catastrophe, but it was something they could not ignore. An assignment that should have been submitted on time slipped past while Hana ran between a shift and a family errand. When Hana realized, their stomach dropped. They sat on a campus bench with their bag at their feet and felt, for a moment, as if the air had been knocked out of them. Hana's first instinct was to hide, to apologize quickly, to promise it would not happen again, to pull an all-nighter and erase the mistake. But sitting there, feeling the weight of their own exhaustion. Hannah noticed how alone they had been trying to be in all of this, as if needing help meant failing. The next day, Hannah did something different. They went to office hours. The hallway outside the professor's door was quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your footsteps sound louder than you want them to. Hannah waited, then stepped inside when it was their turn. They did not offer a long story. They simply told the truth in a plain voice. They were juggling school, work, and family responsibilities, and they had dropped something. They asked if there was any way to submit late, and if the professor had suggestions for managing the course workload in a more realistic way. The professor listened. Not every person responds well, Hannah knew, but this professor did. They asked a few practical questions and then offered a small extension. They also suggested a way to prioritize the most important parts of the reading and reminded Hannah that asking early, before things collapsed completely, was wise. Hannah left the office with a lighter bag, even though the textbooks inside weighed the same. That small success made Hannah braver. A few days later, they spoke with their manager at the part-time job. Hannah had been taking extra shifts whenever they were offered, afraid to seem ungrateful. Now they asked, respectfully, for a more predictable schedule for a while, fewer last-minute changes. They explained that they were in school and needed stable study time. The manager looked at the roster, sighed, and agreed to adjust, not perfectly, but enough. Then Hannah did the hardest conversation, the one that lived at the center of their guilt. At home. After dinner, they spoke with their family. They said they were feeling stretched too thin. They said they needed help with some of the household tasks, and they needed certain evenings to be protected for studying and sleep. They did not blame anyone. They just named what was true. The family responded with a mix of surprise and care. A sibling protested at first, then softened. A parent looked tired and apologetic and said they had not realized how much Hannah was carrying. Together, they rearranged a few things, a shared chore list, a ride schedule, a plan for groceries on weekends instead of random late-night trips. Hannah did not feel instantly calm. Life did not become spacious overnight. But asking for help changed the shape of the load. It moved some weight off one pair of shoulders and into a shared set of hands. That alone made breathing easier. Still, Hannah needed a way to keep the day from exploding in their mind. The old habit had been one endless list, a river of tasks that made everything feel equally urgent. One evening, Hannah sat at the small desk in their room, the lamp making a circle of light on the surface, and decided to try something simpler. They took a sheet of paper and drew a line down the middle. On the left, they wrote what must happen tomorrow. Not 20 items, not a fantasy schedule, just a few non-negotiables. Attend the morning class, submit the revised assignment, work the evening shift. On the right, They wrote what could happen if there was time, review notes, do laundry, answer non-urgent messages, plan next week. The right side was allowed to be long. The left side was kept small on purpose. Hannah called it the two-list day plan: must and could, anchor and extra. The paper stayed visible, not buried in an app. It was gentle because it admitted reality. A day has limits. Hannah began making this two-list plan each evening after dinner as a quiet closing ritual. They would choose tomorrow's musts while the mind was still awake. So the mind did not have to build the list at midnight. The first morning Hannah tried it, they noticed a difference. When they woke, they did not feel the same flood of everything. They had 3 musts and a right-hand list that could wait. During class, when a thought came about laundry or a message, Hannah wrote it on the could side for later and returned to the lecture. At work, when they remembered a reading they wanted to do, they noted it and let it rest. The thoughts still arrived, but they no longer demanded immediate action. There were days when the must list did not all get done. A bus was late. A shift ran longer. A family need appeared. On those days, Hannah practiced something that felt like a new muscle, moving an item to tomorrow without turning it into self-hatred. They would rewrite the two-list plan in the evening and carry forward what truly mattered. The right-hand list became a safe place for unfinished things, a holding area instead of a source of shame. As weeks passed, Hannah's life began to develop small pockets of steadiness, not huge stretches of free time, but reliable moments, a protected hour in the afternoon for studying, a predictable evening to sleep earlier, a morning when they could drink water and look out the window before rushing out. The family routine grew smoother as everyone adjusted. The job schedule became less chaotic. School was still demanding, but it became possible to meet it without constant panic. One night, after a long day that had actually ended, Hannah sat on their bed with the two-list plan folded beside them. The must list for the day had been completed, not perfectly, but enough. The could list still had items on it, and that was okay. Hannah felt a strange relief in letting the unfinished remain unfinished. They turned off the lamp and lay down. The room was quiet except for faint city sounds. Hannah's mind offered up the familiar urge to review everything, to scan for what had been missed. Hannah pictured the two lists instead, the simple line down the page: must and could, today and later, shared load and honest limits. The thoughts softened around that structure, as if the mind could finally stop guarding the day. In the dark, Hannah breathed slowly and felt the body settle. Somewhere, rain began again. Light against the window, steady and patient. Hannah did not have to hold the whole world tonight. They had asked for help. They had made a plan that fit inside a human day. And in that gentle truth, sleep had room to arrive. Mina had joined the startup at the stage where the office still smelled faintly of fresh paint and optimism. when every meeting began with a shared screen and ended with a new list of promises. She was good at the work in a way that made people relax. She caught small inconsistencies before they became bigger problems, remembered the odd customer request that would have been forgotten, and wrote notes that made other people's tasks easier. The company called her a stabilizer, and she took pride in it. The praise came in the modern way, in little flashes. A thumbs up on a late-night message. A quick note of thanks dropped into a channel just before midnight. A manager mentioning her responsiveness in an all-hands, as if speed itself were a form of care. Mina had never been the loudest voice in a room, and she had learned to let her work speak for her. The always-on behavior felt like a clean, simple language. Answer quickly. Solve quickly. Be the person people could reach. At first, it looked like devotion and felt like belonging. Her phone lived in her hand the way a warm mug lived there on winter mornings. She began answering messages while waiting for the elevator, while brushing her teeth, while letting water boil. She told herself she was simply smoothing things out, keeping the engine from knocking. If she replied now, someone else could move forward. If she handled it now, tomorrow would be easier. The startup was young enough that hours were still a rumor. The product had people using it across time zones, and the team was scattered. There was always someone awake. Mina's calendar filled with short meetings that stacked like thin tiles, leaving slivers of time that felt too small for anything important. She used those slivers to catch up, and she used the evening to finish the work that needed longer attention. Sometimes, when a problem appeared late, she stayed on until it was quiet again, the way you stay awake until a busy wave settles. Her friends stopped inviting her to things that required certainty. Her mother learned to ask, gently, if Mina's phone could rest face down during dinner. Mina laughed and promised it could. And then she would flip it over again when she heard the soft vibration against the table. Even when there was nothing urgent, she felt the pull to check. The checking itself became a small ritual, like smoothing a wrinkle in a sheet that no one else could see. The praise kept coming, and it kept her moving. A senior engineer told her she was always there. A founder thanked her for being responsive, even on weekends. Mina took those words in like oxygen and did not notice, at first, what they quietly demanded. It was not a dramatic collapse. It was a slow thinning. Sleep became lighter, less forgiving. She would lie down, and her mind would keep listening for the next ping, the next task that would make her useful. She began waking in the early dark with a tight little list already running through her head. Check the dashboard, answer the last message, remember to follow up. In the morning, she would stand at the sink and stare at her reflection, noticing how she looked a little less like herself, as if her face were an image that had been compressed. One evening, after a day that had been nothing but moving between chat threads and quick calls. She noticed her hands were still shaped like holding her phone, even when it was not there. Her fingers curled slightly, as if the device were invisible. She set a plate on the counter and felt her wrist ache. It was a small thing. It would have been easy to ignore. But the tenderness in her wrist made the whole pattern visible, like a seam showing through fabric. She had a moment of quiet after that. The kitchen window was open a crack, and the air carried the soft sound of someone else's life. Distant voices and a car rolling by. Mina made tea and watched the steam rise and disappear. She realized she could not remember the last time she had waited for water to boil without doing something else. The next morning, she arrived at work early, not to get ahead, but to sit with a notebook before the day began. She wrote down what her always on had actually looked like, the hours, the interruptions, the way her attention was split into thin strands. She wrote down the cost in simple phrases: missed walks, shallow sleep, a body that stayed braced. She was not trying to win an argument with anyone. She was trying to tell the truth to herself. The idea that changed things did not come as a grand epiphany. It came as a practical question. What did people actually need from her? And when did they need it? She had been acting as if every message was an alarm. Most of them were not. Many of them were someone reaching out because the window was open, and Mina had trained them to expect her to be there. She started with one small boundary reset. She turned off push notifications for everything except calls from a short list: her mother, her closest friend, and one on-call line used only for rare emergencies. She left the chat apps installed, but she took them off the home screen so her thumb could not find them by habit. She set her phone to do not disturb after a certain hour, and she made that hour earlier than she felt comfortable with. It felt like choosing to leave a party before the best part. She reminded herself that sleep was not a reward for finishing everything. It was part of how she stayed capable. Then she made her response windows. At work, Mina wrote a short note to her manager. She explained that she was going to try a new communication rhythm so she could protect deep work time and evenings, and so she could stay consistent over the long haul. She offered specifics rather than vague intentions. She would check messages at set times, once in the morning, once after lunch, once mid-afternoon, and once before the end of the day. Outside those windows she would focus. And if something truly urgent came up, there would be a clear way to escalate. Her manager surprised her by being relieved. He had been watching Mina do the work of two people and calling it dedication, because he did not know what else to call it. When Mina put structure around it, it gave him something he could support. He asked her what urgent should mean, and together they made a simple definition: customer impacting issues, release blockers, or safety concerns. Everything else could wait until the next window. Mina posted the plan in the team channel in calm language. She did not scold. She did not make it dramatic. She simply said when she would be reading messages, when she would not, and how to reach her if something truly could not wait. She added one gentle sentence that felt like a hand on her shoulder. If a message did not get an immediate response, it was not being ignored. It was being placed in the next window. The first day, her body still twitched toward the phone. A notification icon appeared, and her attention tried to leap. She practiced letting it sit, like leaving a dish in the sink for a moment, because she was doing something else. It was uncomfortable in a quiet way, like learning to hold a new posture. She reminded herself that she was not abandoning anyone, she was pacing herself. She noticed something unexpected. When she answered in windows, her replies became clearer. She could see patterns across multiple threads and respond with a single solution rather than 10 small reactions. She could write documentation in one sitting instead of in fragments. She began to close loops instead of spinning them. There was a second boundary reset that mattered just as much. Mina stopped signaling availability with instant acknowledgements. She had developed the habit of replying with quick confirmations to everything, which gave people the comfort of immediacy and gave her the burden of carrying every request at once. Now, she waited until her next window, then she responded with a plan. When she would look, what she needed from the requester, and when they could expect an update. Some teammates adjusted easily. Others tested the old pattern, posting questions late at night the way they always had. Mina saw them in the morning window and answered then. Nothing broke. Everything kept moving. A few times she felt a flare of anxiety, as if she had missed a signal. Each time, she went back to the definition of urgent and found it steady. Her evenings changed slowly, the way the light changes as the sun moves across a room. The first week, she still carried her laptop to the couch, just in case. The second week, she left it on the desk. She started making simple dinners without checking messages between steps. She noticed the sound of chopping vegetables. She noticed the way water looked in a glass when the kitchen was quiet. One Friday, her team shipped a small feature that had required careful coordination. Mina had been part of it, but she had not been the person answering messages at midnight. The feature still shipped. In the team channel, someone thanked her for keeping the process organized, for her documentation, for her calm. The praise was different. It was about the quality of her work, not the speed of her replies. Mina felt something soften in her chest, like a clenched hand opening. Her sleep shifted. It did not become perfect overnight, and she did not treat it like a scoreboard. But she began to fall asleep without bracing for interruption. She began to wake without the immediate urge to check. On some mornings, she lay still for a moment, and listened to the quiet, feeling the weight of the blanket and the honest tiredness of a body that had actually rested. The response windows became a kind of kindness to her future self. They also became a model for others. A newer teammate asked Mina how she managed to focus, and Mina described the windows in a casual way, as if talking about how she kept her desk tidy. The teammate tried it too. Soon, meetings began to include small agreements about when to expect answers. The team stopped treating every message like an emergency because they had a structure that made emergencies stand out. Mina's work did not become less important. It became more sustainable. She still cared. She still solved problems. But she stopped confusing care with constant availability. She learned that boundaries were not walls. They were doors with hours. So she could open them fully when it mattered and close them gently when it did not. One night, months after she started, Mina washed her cup and set it upside down on the drying rack. Her phone was in another room. She could feel its absence the way you feel an empty space on a shelf. And it did not frighten her. She turned off the kitchen light and walked to bed. The sheets were cool, then warm. She exhaled and let the day fold itself away. In the quiet, her mind did not scan for pings. It drifted, unhurried, into sleep. June had not planned to become a creator. The word sounded shiny, like a job you wore instead of did. He began the way many people did, by making something useful for a few friends. Short videos about organizing a tiny apartment, about cooking simple meals, about building calm routines in a loud world. He liked the work itself. He liked the quiet planning, the small decisions about light and angle, the satisfaction of cutting away clutter until the message was clear. At the beginning, the numbers were just a surprise that arrived after the work was done. A video would do better than he expected, and he would feel a warm pulse of amazement. A comment would say the video helped someone. He would close his laptop and go to sleep with a sense that he had contributed something gentle. Then, without anyone announcing it, the numbers stopped being a surprise and became the main event. June downloaded an analytics app because it seemed responsible. He told himself it was part of learning the craft. He checked it in the morning, like checking the weather. He checked it once more at lunch, just to see what had happened. He checked it in the evening, because he was curious. Curiosity is an easy doorway. Over time it widened. June began to notice that the analytics refreshed in small jumps. The page would load, and then, with a tiny delay, the count would change. That delay became a hook. His mind started to chase it, like waiting for toast to pop. He found himself refreshing while water boiled, refreshing while a file exported, refreshing while he was supposed to be watching a movie with a friend. The numbers were never stable, and his attention learned to match them, restless and scanning. He also started to interpret his own days through those numbers. If views were up, his shoulders loosened. If views were flat, his mood dimmed. If a post did poorly, he felt as if he had done something wrong as a person. Not as if one piece of work had simply met the world at an odd angle. He tried to correct it by doing more. More posts, more edits, more changes to titles and thumbnails, more late-night tweaks. He carried the sense of unfinishedness into bed, scrolling through his own comments like someone rereading a message that might contain a hidden warning. Even good news did not settle him. A spike in views made him feel briefly relieved, then uneasy, because he wanted the spike to continue. His mind began to live just ahead of itself, thinking about the next upload, the next possible decline, the next reason a platform might stop showing his work. The craft he loved, the careful shaping of a quiet idea, became tangled with a low hum of vigilance. The burnout did not look like loud drama. It looked like watching a sunset and wondering how it would perform. It looked like taking a walk and thinking about what he could film. It looked like going to bed tired but not sleepy, because his mind was still checking. One night, he sat on the floor of his living room, surrounded by the soft mess of a creator's life. A tripod leaning in the corner, a small microphone on the table, a ring light folded like a collapsed halo. He held his phone and refreshed the dashboard. The number changed by a small amount. He refreshed again. It changed again. It was such a small motion, a thumb sliding down. And yet his whole body had learned to expect something from it. He noticed his breathing. It was shallow, as if he were waiting for a result. He put the phone face down on the rug and watched his hand for a moment. The hand looked ordinary. The habit looked strange. He did not vow to quit, not in a dramatic way. He simply admitted a plain truth. The refreshing was not helping him make better work. It was making him smaller, narrower, more reactive. It was turning his attention into a thin thread that could fray. The change began with a weekly review. June chose one day, a day that already had a quiet feeling to it. For him, it was Monday morning, when the city seemed a little slower. He made a cup of coffee, sat at his desk, and opened the analytics on a larger screen. He looked at the numbers once, deliberately, without refreshing. He wrote down what mattered, what he posted, what did well, what did not, what kind of comments appeared, what topics seemed to land with people. He treated the data as information, not as a verdict. Then he closed the tab. The first time he did this, it felt reckless. His mind tried to invent urgency. What if something changed? What if he missed the moment when a video took off? What if he should have replied to a comment quickly? He watched those thoughts arrive like waves, and he let them pass without chasing them. To make the weekly review work, he needed a second change, one that was kinder and harder: process, goals. He realized he had been living under outcome goals that he could not control. He wanted certain numbers, and the wanting made him tense. Process goals were different. They were actions he could actually do. He wrote them down in plain language on a sheet of paper and taped it to the wall above his desk. It was not decoration. It was a small agreement with himself. Each week he would write 3 ideas, even if they were imperfect. Each week he would draft 1 script to completion. Each week he would film on 2 afternoons, no more, no less. Each week he would spend 1 hour learning something specific about the craft, like sound or pacing. Each week he would rest 1 full day without filming or editing. These goals did not depend on applause. They depended on his presence. He made a simple rule to protect the system. The analytics app came off his phone. He did not delete his accounts or disappear. He simply moved the numbers out of his pocket. If he truly needed to check something, he could do it during the weekly review on a larger screen, with a notebook open, in a context that invited thought rather than reflex. The days that followed were oddly quiet. The silence, where the refreshing used to be felt like an empty room. June noticed how often his hand reached for the phone with no purpose. He began to replace that reaching with small, ordinary actions: washing a dish, watering a plant, stepping onto the balcony for fresh air. These actions did not give him a quick jolt, but they gave him something more stable, a sense of being in his own life. He also changed how he decided what to make. Instead of asking every day what the audience wanted, he asked what he could make with care. He made a list of topics that felt honest: slow mornings, simple meals, tidy spaces, gentle ways of starting over. He did not forbid himself from being strategic. He simply made strategy a tool, not a master. There were moments of temptation. A friend would mention a new feature on a platform, and June's mind would itch to check how his posts were doing. He noticed the itch and kept walking. He told himself he would see the information on Monday. It did not need to be answered tonight. The weekly reviews became a soft anchor. Over time, they turned the numbers into something less mystical. Some weeks were up, some weeks were down. June stopped treating those shifts as a personal prophecy. He began to see patterns that were actually useful. Which topics he enjoyed making, which formats drained him, how long he could edit before his judgment got blurry. He adjusted the process goals with kindness, not punishment. Because he was no longer checking constantly, he had more attention for the work itself. He began to edit with patience again. He noticed the quiet moment in a clip that made the whole video feel human. He let his voice be softer. He let pauses exist. He trusted that the right people would find it in their own time. His sleep changed in a way that felt almost embarrassingly simple. When he removed the constant measurement, his mind had fewer loose ends to count. He could finish a day's work and actually feel finished. He began to read before bed. Not to learn a trick, but to let his imagination drift. He began to leave his phone in the other room at night, charging on a shelf like a tool put away. On a Monday months later, he sat down for his weekly review and noticed something that would have thrilled his older self. The numbers had grown steadily. But what mattered more was how he received that information. He nodded, wrote it down, and then turned to his process list. He felt grateful, but he did not feel captured. He had learned a quiet distinction. The metrics were a mirror held by strangers, and mirrors could be interesting, even helpful, but they were not a home. His home was the work he could touch, the script, the light, the edit, the steady practice. When he built his week around that home, the rest became background, like traffic heard from a distance. That evening he cooked dinner without filming it. He ate slowly. He washed the dish and dried his hands. The room was dim, the kind of dim that invites the eyes to relax. He went to bed and let his mind wander through ideas without chasing their performance. In the dark, there was no dashboard to refresh. There was only breath, steady and quiet, and the gentle feeling of having done enough for one day. Hannah worked from a small desk that faced a wall, not because she loved the wall, but because it was the only place in the apartment where she could fit a chair and still open the closet. The desk held a laptop, a mug, and a scatter of small objects that belonged to her child: a plastic dinosaur, a crayon with its paper peeled away, a sticker that had lost its stickiness. It was the kind of desk that made it impossible to pretend work and life were separate worlds. They overlapped in plain sight. When she accepted the remote job, it sounded like relief. She imagined quiet mornings, deep focus, the chance to be present at home. She did not imagine the way remote work could seep into everything, especially when the person at home was a small human with an honest appetite for attention. Her child, Jun, was in that bright age where every thought wanted to be shared immediately. A question about where the moon went in the daytime could arrive in the same moment as Hannah's meeting reminder. A need for a snack could appear exactly when she was trying to write an email that required care. Hannah loved Jun with a steady tenderness that surprised her, and she also felt worn down by the constant switching. She was always moving between modes: parent, employee, parent, employee, and in the in-between spaces, she was still a person who had not slept enough. Daycare helped, but it was not a perfect wall. There were days when Jun stayed home with a mild cold, days when a teacher training closed the center early, days when the city's weather made walking out feel like too much. Hannah's partner, Minho, also worked, and their schedules did not always fit together like neat puzzle pieces. Some days Hannah felt as if she were holding a cup under a dripping faucet, trying to catch everything, and the water never stopped. The burnout showed up as irritation at small things: the sound of the notification chime, the tightness of a calendar packed with meetings, the sight of dirty dishes that seemed to multiply as soon as she turned away. It showed up as a sense of being behind, even when she was working constantly. It showed up as guilt, a thick kind that sat in her chest. Guilt for not being fully present with Jun. Guilt for not being fully present at work. Guilt for wanting a quiet room. Guilt for feeling guilty. At night, when the apartment finally became still, Hana would try to use the silence to catch up. She would open her laptop after Jun was asleep and answer the messages she had postponed. The screen light made her eyes feel dry. The work she did at night was not her best work, but it was work she could do without being interrupted, and so she did it. She told herself it was temporary. Temporary became normal. Her days began earlier, not because she wanted to wake up early, but because she needed the time. She would slide out of bed before Jun woke and sit at the desk, wrapped in a cardigan, trying to finish something important while the apartment was still a quiet shell. Sometimes she managed an hour of clean focus. Sometimes she spent the hour listening for footsteps. When Jun woke, the day's rhythm shifted and Hana's attention began to fragment. The turning point arrived on an ordinary morning. Jun was coloring at the coffee table, humming softly, and Hana was in a video call with her team. She tried to keep her voice steady, while Jun tugged at her sleeve, showing a drawing. Hana nodded at the screen and nodded at Jun, and she felt a sudden clarity that was not dramatic, only precise. She could not keep living as if she had to be in two places at once. The constant splitting was not a personal failure. It was a design problem. Later that day, she took a notebook and sat in the quietest corner she could find, which was the hallway floor by the front door. She looked at her week, the way you look at a room you have been living in for too long. Finally noticing the layout, meetings were scattered. Tasks that required deep thought were squeezed into 15-minute gaps. Caregiving happened wherever it could, like water finding cracks. She stopped trying to push harder and decided to redesign. The first step was to name the real constraints without blame. Jun needed attention in the mornings and after daycare. Jun needed lunch on days at home. Hana needed certain blocks of time to do work that required concentration. Hana also needed recovery, not as a luxury, but as basic maintenance. She began by reshaping her workday into a clearer structure. She chose 2 blocks for deep work and protected them as if they were meetings with someone important. 1 block was early, before Jun woke, and 1 block was midday on daycare days, when the apartment had a different kind of quiet. She moved non-urgent meetings into late morning or early afternoon, when she knew she could be present without listening for a child's needs. She started to decline meetings that were optional, and she offered alternatives, like written updates. This was not a bold rebellion. It was a careful attempt to make the week livable. She also changed how she handled caregiving during work hours. instead of trying to do tasks while Jun played nearby and feeling constantly interrupted. She created clear together windows when Jun was home. A morning window with breakfast and play. A midday window with lunch and a short walk, if weather allowed. And an afternoon window when she could be fully in parent mode. During those windows, she did not attempt to do serious work. She let herself be there. In return, during work blocks, she arranged for small supports. Sometimes Minho took Jun to the park for an hour. Sometimes a neighbor watched Jun while Hana finished a call. Sometimes she leaned on a simple screen time routine without apologizing for it. She treated these supports as part of the schedule, not as evidence she was failing. The schedule redesign helped. But Hana knew she also needed a way to lower the constant tension in her body. She could not wait for a full vacation to feel human again. So she added micro breaks. They were small on purpose, so small they could fit into any day. After a meeting, she stood up and looked out the window for 1 full minute, letting her eyes rest on something distant. Between tasks, she put both feet on the floor and felt the contact, noticing the chair under her legs. Before opening her inbox, she rolled her shoulders and unclenched her jaw. When Jun was home, and she felt irritation rising, she stepped into the bathroom for 30 seconds, washed her hands slowly, and returned with cooler breath. These were not techniques meant to fix her life. They were tiny pauses that reminded her she had a body. She also made one change that felt less practical and more essential. She worked on releasing guilt. Hana had been carrying an invisible standard from an earlier version of herself, the version who could work late without consequence and still wake up fresh. She had been trying to meet that standard while living a different life. The mismatch created shame, and shame made everything harder. She began to practice a new thought, simple and stubborn. The goal was not to do everything perfectly. The goal was to do what mattered, with care, and to let the rest be less than ideal. She wrote it in her notebook, not as inspiration, but as permission. She reminded herself that care and work were both real, and that no one could fully optimize them at the same time. She started to measure her days by gentler signs. Did Jun feel loved today? Did she finish one meaningful task at work? Did she eat something that was not rushed? Did she take a few breaths that belonged only to her? The changes did not remove all difficulty. Jun still had days when he needed more. Work still had deadlines. But the texture of Hana's life shifted. She stopped waking with immediate heaviness. She began to trust the schedule enough to stop scanning for what she was missing. When she was with Jun, she was more present because she was not trying to multitask in secret. When she was working, she felt less fragmented because she had already planned for the caregiving parts of the day. Her colleagues noticed something too, not because she announced it, but because her communication became steadier. She responded with clearer timeframes instead of quick apologies. She set expectations about when she could reply. She made fewer promises, and the promises she made were easier to keep. At home, the evenings became softer. Hannah stopped using the last hour of the night as a second shift whenever she could. Instead, she built a small closing ritual. She tidied the desk just enough that it looked like a place someone could return to. She put the dinosaur and the crayon into a small basket. She wrote down the next day's first task so her mind would not keep repeating it in bed. Then she turned the laptop off. Sometimes, after Jun was asleep, she sat on the floor with the lights low and listened to the quiet. The apartment still held the evidence of the day. A cup in the sink, a blanket on the couch, toys half put away. She practiced letting that evidence be. She did not need a perfect house to deserve rest. One Saturday morning, weeks after the redesign, Hannah walked with Jun to a small park. The air was cool and the trees moved gently. Jun ran ahead and then returned, as children do, to check that she was still there. Hannah watched him and felt the familiar tug of worry about all the work waiting. Then she felt her feet on the path and the weight of the day's simplicity. The work could wait. The schedule held it. The guilt did not need to steer. That night, she went to bed earlier than usual. Not as an act of discipline, but as an act of respect for the life she was actually living. She lay down and let her mind release the day in pieces. A meeting, a snack, a walk, a laugh, an email sent, a toy picked up, a micro break taken. None of it was perfect. All of it was enough. In that honest enoughness, sleep came more easily. Like a door that finally knew it was allowed to close. Lena's alarm went off before the sky had decided on a color. She reached for the phone without opening her eyes. Not because she needed the time, but because she needed the first small victory of the day, the swipe, the silence, the sense that she was already ahead. In the dim light of her apartment, the world was reduced to quiet surfaces. The countertop, the back of a chair, the neat stack of mail she had sorted into a tray. Even the air felt organized. She liked it that way. Order meant she was safe, and productivity was the kind of order she could prove. She had spent years building a life that could be measured. It started innocently, the way these things often do, with planners and tidy lists and the gentle satisfaction of crossing things out. Somewhere along the way, the list stopped being a tool and became a mirror. A good day was a day with boxes checked, lines drawn, colors filled in. A bad day was a day that left space. She didn't like space. Space invited questions, and questions invited feelings, and feelings were less cooperative than tasks. Her calendar was a mosaic of commitments. Meetings slid into workouts, workouts into errands, errands into personal development, which was how she labeled the hours she spent reading articles about efficiency while eating dinner in front of her laptop. The labels made her feel responsible, and responsibility felt like worth. When she was praised for being reliable, she absorbed it like warmth. When she was told she was impressive, she felt briefly anchored. Then the feeling faded, and she went looking for the next thing to do. At work, she was the person who replied quickly. She was the person who remembered the detail no one else had written down. She was the person who volunteered before someone could ask. She liked the way people leaned on her, as if her steadiness could hold up the room. She also resented it, quietly, in a way she never admitted. Resentment didn't fit on the list, so she turned it into more output. If she felt restless, she created a new system. If she felt lonely, she scheduled more. If she felt tired, she optimized. Nights were the hardest. In the evening, when the world softened and other people drifted into their own lives, Lena's mind kept its bright posture. She would close her laptop and still see spreadsheets behind her eyelids. She would brush her teeth and mentally draft a message she didn't need to send. She would lie down and count the day, like inventory tasks completed, messages answered, steps taken, time used well. Sleep, for her, was not a refuge, it was maintenance. An enforced pause that only mattered because it allowed her to perform again. Sometimes she tried to rest on purpose. She would plan it like a project, a quiet Saturday, a simple lunch, an hour of reading, but rest, when scheduled, made her tense. She would sit with a book and look up every few minutes, as if someone might walk in and catch her not working. Even the pleasure of a story felt like something she had to justify, and justification required effort. She would end up standing, wiping down the already clean counter, reorganizing a drawer that didn't need attention. Her body moved because stillness felt like failure. One afternoon, a small thing happened that should not have mattered. She opened the app she used to track her habits and found that it had reset after an update. A week of check marks had vanished. The colored streak she had been guarding like a flame was gone, replaced by a blank grid. For a few seconds, she just stared at it, as if she were looking at a mistake in her own skin. The emptiness felt personal. She told herself it was ridiculous, that the work still existed, that she still did the things. But her chest tightened anyway. Without the record, the days seemed less real. She spent the next hour trying to recover the data, tapping, searching, reading help pages. When she finally gave up, she sat back and realized her jaw hurt from clenching. The room was quiet. The afternoon light had moved across the floor without her noticing. She had been fighting for proof of her own effort, and the proof was not even for anyone else. It was for the part of her that believed she disappeared if she stopped producing evidence. That evening her friend Mira sent a message asking if Lena could come by. Mira was packing to move across town. Nothing dramatic. Just a new lease and a need for a second pair of hands. Lena replied immediately, of course. helpful was her native language. She arrived with a tote bag of supplies she'd grabbed on the way: packing tape, labels, a marker that wouldn't smear. She carried them up the stairs as if delivering something essential. Mira opened the door looking tired, hair pinned up in a careless twist, boxes half built. The place smelled like cardboard and citrus cleaner. Lena set down the tote and started reaching for tape, already scanning for the most efficient order of operations. Mira, though, didn't hand her a task. She didn't say where to start. She simply took a breath and asked if Lena could sit for a minute. Lena froze, not outwardly, but inside, where her motor lived. Sitting felt like hovering at the edge of usefulness. She perched on the couch, knees together, hands folded, waiting for instructions. Mira went to the kitchen and came back with 2 mugs of warm tea. She handed one to Lena and sat down on the floor with her back against the coffee table, as if the floor were the only place that felt honest. For a while, they didn't do much. Mira pointed out which books were staying, which were going, and then she stopped talking and just watched dust drift in the slant of light from the window. Lena felt her own mind reaching for a to-do list. She wanted to ask practical questions, to direct, to fix. But Mira didn't seem broken. She seemed simply human, in the middle of change, needing company more than strategy. Lena realized, with a quiet shock, that Mira had not invited her for labor. She had invited her for presence. That word felt unfamiliar in this context. Presence was what you gave when you didn't have anything else. Presence was what you offered when the person in front of you mattered more than the outcome. Lena took a sip of tea. It tasted plain and comforting, nothing impressive, nothing optimized. Mira began to talk, slowly, about how strange it felt to leave a place she had lived in for years. Not sad. Exactly. Just tender. She described the way the hallway light always flickered, and how she would miss it. And Lena listened. She listened without turning the conversation into a plan. She listened without trying to turn Mira's feelings into a solvable problem. The longer she listened, the more her shoulders dropped, as if her body had been waiting for permission to be simple. After a while, Mira looked over and thanked Lena, not for helping, but for coming. She said the apartment had felt too quiet lately, and having another person there made it easier to breathe. There was no compliment about efficiency, no praise for being impressive. There was gratitude for being there. Lena felt something warm and strange behind her ribs, like a door opening into a room she had kept locked. She had not earned this moment. She had not produced it. She was receiving it anyway. They did pack later, but it happened in a different rhythm. Lena still folded paper and taped boxes, but the work was braided with pauses. Mira played an old playlist from college. They found a photo and laughed softly. They stopped to eat sliced fruit straight from the cutting board. The evening held them without demanding proof of excellence. When Lena finally left, carrying an empty mug to the sink before she went, she realized she had not thought about her streak once. On the walk home, the air was cool and mild. Streetlights made small pools of gold on the sidewalk. Lena passed windows where people were moving around in their own quiet routines, washing dishes, reading, brushing a dog. It occurred to her that most of life happened outside of metrics. The world kept turning on acts that would never be tracked, acts that were still real, listening, stirring soup, turning down a blanket, walking slowly enough to notice the trees. That night, she did something she rarely allowed herself. She left her phone in the kitchen. She didn't announce it as a productivity experiment. She didn't label it. She simply set it down and walked away. In the bedroom, she turned on a small lamp and sat on the edge of the bed. The room felt larger without the glow of the screen. The silence wasn't empty, it was soft. She thought about the way Mira had thanked her. Not for output, for presence. Lena tried to imagine herself as someone whose value didn't disappear when she stopped moving. The thought was uncomfortable, like wearing a new fabric against her skin. But it was also relieving, like loosening a tight knot. The next morning, habit pulled her toward the phone, toward the urge to prove she was on track. She noticed the urge without obeying it right away. She made coffee and stood by the window while it brewed. The city was waking up in its own time. A person across the street opened curtains. A delivery truck rolled past without hurry. Lena breathed in the smell of coffee and let the day arrive without immediately converting it into tasks. She didn't become a different person overnight. She still liked checking things off. She still cared about doing well. But she began to practice a small, steady shift. When she finished a piece of work, she tried to pause before reaching for the next one. When she felt the itch of restlessness, she asked herself whether she was trying to avoid emptiness or simply trying to live. Sometimes she chose a walk without tracking it. Sometimes she sat with a book and let her mind wander. She found that wandering didn't erase her. It gave her room to be whole. She also began to notice the ways people valued her that had nothing to do with performance. A coworker asked her how her weekend had been and actually waited for the answer. A neighbor smiled when she held the elevator door. Mira sent a photo of her new living room and told Lena she missed their quiet tea. None of it was about output. All of it was about connection. And connection didn't require constant proving. One evening, weeks later, Lena sat down on her couch with nothing in her hands. The sky outside the window was turning from pale to deeper blue. She felt her mind reach for a list, and she let it pass like a train moving through a station. She listened to the soft sound of the building settling, the distant hum of traffic, her own breath. The moment was plain and unremarkable. That was the point. When she went to bed, she didn't review the day like a report. She let the day be a day. She let herself be a person inside it, not a machine. In the darkness, she remembered a simple truth she had been practicing, gentle as a hand resting on a shoulder. She was allowed to exist, even when she wasn't producing anything. And, in that allowance, sleep had a little more space to arrive. There was a time when Jonah believed that being informed was the same as being prepared. He told himself it was responsible to know what was happening everywhere, all the time. He didn't say this with pride, exactly. It was more like a rule he had absorbed without noticing. The way a person learns to keep a key in the same pocket. If there was trouble in the world, he wanted to see it early. If there was breaking news, he wanted to be the first to understand. He didn't think of it as curiosity. He thought of it as vigilance. His mornings began with a screen. Before his feet touched the floor, his thumb was already moving, pulling new headlines into his half-awake mind. The phone's light turned his bedroom into a small stage, bright in the center and shadowed at the edges. He read about weather and politics and markets and difficult events, and the words slid into him before he had even tasted water. Somewhere in the back of his thoughts was the idea that if he kept up, he would be less surprised by life, less vulnerable. The world would not catch him unready. But the feed did not end. At lunch, he checked again, telling himself he only wanted an update. In the afternoon, he glanced between tasks. A quick look that turned into 15 minutes, that turned into an hour. It wasn't only the big stories. It was the commentary, the reactions, the endless churn of people arguing and predicting and warning. Each scroll offered the promise of clarity, and each one delivered more noise. By evening, Jonah felt as if his mind were full of other people's emergencies. He would finish dinner with the taste of something he barely noticed, because he had been reading while he chewed. He would stand at the sink with his hands in warm water, scanning a summary of a hard story far away, unable to do anything about it, and unable to look away. The feeling was not dramatic. It was steady and heavy, like carrying a bag that never got set down. At night, he tried to unwind the way many people do now. He lay in bed and told himself he would scroll until he felt sleepy. The room was quiet, the sheets cool at first, but his mind stayed bright. A headline would catch him, then a clip, then a thread. There were always more updates, more angles, more things he could read. He kept going as if the right piece of information would finally let him relax. As if knowledge were a key that would lock the door against uncertainty. Sometimes he would put the phone down and stare into the dark, eyes wide, thoughts racing in circles. He would think of the world's problems as if they were tasks on his own list, and he would feel guilty for being in bed while the feed kept moving. His chest felt tight, not in a way that made him afraid, but in a way that made it hard to settle. Sleep became something he postponed, a luxury he felt he hadn't earned because he hadn't finished paying attention. One day, a friend invited him to an evening at a small neighborhood bookstore. It wasn't a special event, just a quiet reading and a chance to browse. Jonah almost declined. It didn't fit his usual routines, and he had a vague sense that he should stay home and catch up on everything he'd missed during the day. But he went, partly because his friend had asked, in a way that sounded hopeful, and Jonah had learned to say yes to people, even when he didn't know how to say yes to himself. The bookstore was warm and dim, the kind of place with wooden shelves and a bell that chimed when someone entered. The air smelled faintly of paper and dust and tea. Jonah wandered between stacks, touching spines without thinking, as if his hands remembered a life from before his phone became an extension of his attention. He found a table with old magazines and newspapers laid out like calm artifacts. The pages were quiet. The words did not update. Nothing blinked at him. When the reading began, the room settled into a shared stillness. People listened. A few took notes on paper. Jonah noticed, with mild surprise, that his mind could rest on a single voice without needing to check for something else. He felt the muscles in his neck loosen. The quiet did not feel empty here. It felt held, as if the walls were doing part of the work of containing the world. On the way home, his friend suggested a simple experiment. Not a grand detox, not a vow to stop caring. Just an adjustment, choosing when to take in information instead of letting it seep in at all hours. Jonah didn't argue. He was too tired to defend his habits. He nodded and said he would try. He started small. The next morning, he delayed opening his phone until after he had stood at the window for a moment. He noticed the weather. He noticed the way the light fell across the buildings. Then he made coffee and drank it without reading. The world did not collapse in those few minutes. His body did not punish him for not knowing immediately. The quiet was not dangerous. It was simply quiet. He set a few gentle boundaries. He turned off push notifications, not because he wanted ignorance, but because he wanted choice. He moved news apps off his home screen. He unsubscribed from accounts that existed mainly to keep him agitated. He chose a couple of sources he trusted and decided he would check them at specific times. Like a person opening a newspaper instead of living inside an alarm. The biggest change was what he did at night. He created an analog wind down, the kind he remembered from childhood without realizing he had lost it. An hour before bed, he put his phone on a charger in the kitchen and left it there. The first few nights felt strange. His hand reached for the absent weight out of habit, like a phantom reflex. He noticed the urge, waited through it, and watched it fade. In the living room, he turned on a small lamp, softer than the overhead light. He made a cup of something warm. He kept a paperback on the table, a simple novel that did not require him to analyze the state of the world. If his mind felt restless, he wrote a few lines in a notebook. Nothing profound, just what he had done that day. What he needed to remember tomorrow, what could wait. The act of putting thoughts on paper felt like setting down a bag. He also found small, quiet tasks that didn't drag him into urgency. He folded laundry slowly. He rinsed dishes and listened to the water. He put a plant back into its pot and pressed the soil gently around the roots. These were not solutions to global problems. They were acts of care in a room he could actually touch. Proof that his attention could be used in a way that didn't leave him scorched. At first, he worried that stepping away from the feed made him selfish. Then he noticed something else. When he limited his intake, his mind became clearer during the day. He could read one article carefully, instead of skimming 50 with rising dread. He could choose one small action: donate, volunteer, have a thoughtful conversation, rather than soaking in suffering until he felt numb. Rest, he realized, didn't erase compassion. It protected it. Some nights were still noisy. The world still contained hard news, and Jonah still cared. He didn't become indifferent. He simply stopped trying to hold everything at once, especially in the hours when his body was asking for sleep. He began to treat night like a boundary around his own calm, a gentle fence that said, "You can return to the world in the morning, and you will do it with more steadiness if you rest now." Over time, the analog wind down started to feel like a ritual rather than a restriction. The lamp became a signal. The mug became a comfort. The pages of the book became a soft place for his mind to land. When he turned out the light, he was no longer carrying a chorus of voices into the dark. He was carrying a single, quieter thread, the sense that he was allowed to stop consuming. The world would keep moving. He would meet it again after sleep, with whatever strength the night could gently restore. Sora moved to a new city with the kind of hope that fits neatly inside a suitcase. She told herself that a different skyline would change her breathing, that new streets would rearrange her habits. In her old life, she had been tired in a way that felt woven into her identity. She had tried time off. She had tried weekends that were meant to be restorative, and somehow she always returned to the same pace. When the opportunity came to transfer to a smaller office in a coastal town, she accepted quickly, as if distance itself could do the work. The first week felt like a fresh page. She walked unfamiliar blocks and read storefront signs like small poems. She bought fruit from a market where the seller remembered her face after only a few visits. She watched the ocean from a bench and let the horizon do its slow work on her thoughts. At night, the air through the window smelled faintly of salt instead of exhaust. She slept a little more easily, partly from the effort of moving, partly from the relief of novelty. She decorated her new apartment with care, as if arranging objects could arrange a life. A simple table by the window, a plant that liked bright light, a basket for keys so she wouldn't lose them in the rush of leaving. She made plans that sounded gentle. Morning walks, dinners cooked at home, maybe a weekend class for something she had never had time to learn. Then her old pattern arrived, not with drama, but with familiarity. The new job introduced new people, and Sora wanted to prove she belonged. She stayed late to finish things that could have waited. She replied to messages as quickly as she used to, because speed felt like competence. She volunteered for projects, because being needed felt safer than being ordinary. The town was quieter than her old city, but her mind carried the same motor. Outside of work, she filled her calendar as if empty days were a threat. She said yes to networking dinners and weekend workshops and casual invitations that required a lot of energy. She didn't want to be lonely, and she didn't want to miss anything. She told herself she was building a new community. In truth, she was building a new schedule, and the schedule began to look suspiciously like the one she had left behind. Some evenings she would come home and stand in the kitchen with her bag still on her shoulder, staring at the sink, the table, the quiet. She would feel the tug to open her laptop, to plan, to catch up, to make the day feel finished. The ocean was still outside, steady and patient, but she rarely went to see it. She had moved for a reset and somehow recreated the same spinning wheel, just in a different room. One night, after a long day that ended in yet another quick check of email that became an hour, she sat on the floor with her back against the couch. It wasn't dramatic. She was simply tired, in a way that made her thoughts feel thin. She looked around the apartment, clean, quiet, carefully arranged, and felt a mild ache of disappointment. She had believed that geography would do the work she couldn't do. She had believed she could outrun her habits by changing the view. The next morning, she went for a walk without a destination. The town was waking slowly. Someone swept a storefront. A dog trotted beside its person. The air felt cool and gentle. As she passed a small community garden tucked between buildings, she noticed a gate slightly open and a chalkboard sign, inviting neighbors to join for an evening work session. The sign was plain, the kind that didn't beg for attention. It simply offered a place. Sora walked past, then stopped, then turned back. She didn't know why. Maybe it was because the invitation didn't sound like an achievement. It sounded like something ordinary people did together. She copied the time into her phone, then immediately felt the irony and laughed quietly to herself. That evening she went. The garden was small but alive. Raised beds, herbs, a few stubborn flowers. A handful of people moved around with watering cans and gloves, talking in low voices. No one asked her what she did for work. No one seemed impressed by business. A woman with grey hair and dirt under her fingernails handed Sora a trowel and pointed her toward a patch of soil that needed clearing. The task was simple. The pace was slow. The goal was not perfection, just care. Sora worked beside strangers without feeling she had to perform. She pulled weeds, loosened soil, watered gently. The repetitive motion steadied her. Conversation drifted in and out. Someone talked about a neighbor's new baby. Someone mentioned a recipe. Someone asked Sora how long she'd lived in town and when she answered. They nodded and welcomed her without demanding a narrative of success. After the garden session, a few people lingered near the gate. They talked about meeting again the next week, about who could bring extra seedlings. One person offered to share herbs. Another mentioned a Sunday potluck. The invitations were casual and specific, anchored in real time, not in vague intention. Sora surprised herself by saying she would come. She kept going back, not because it fixed her, but because it created a rhythm she didn't have to invent alone. The garden didn't care how productive she had been that day. It asked only that she show up and do a small thing with her hands. The people there remembered her name. They asked if she'd been sleeping better, and she could answer honestly, some nights, yes, some nights, not yet. They nodded like that was normal. Through the garden group, Sora met a person named Elias, who lived a few blocks away. He was not a mentor, not a savior, just someone with a steady manner. One evening, as they washed soil from their hands at a spigot, Sora mentioned that she kept falling into old patterns, staying late, saying yes, filling every space. Elias didn't lecture her. He simply suggested something practical, a weekly check-in. The way the garden did. A message on Sunday evenings, nothing heavy. Just a note about one small boundary they wanted to keep in the coming week. Sora agreed before she could overthink it. The first Sunday, she wrote that she wanted to leave work at a reasonable hour, at least a few nights. Elias wrote back with his own small intention, to take a walk after dinner instead of opening his laptop. The simplicity of it was almost embarrassing. There were no grand declarations. There was only a small promise made to another human being who would notice if she disappeared. The accountability changed things in a quiet way. When Sora reached for her phone at the end of the day to check email one more time, she would remember that she had told someone she wanted to stop. She didn't always succeed, but the memory introduced a pause, and the pause introduced choice. When she stayed late at the office, she had to acknowledge it as a decision rather than an inevitability. She began to experiment with slower consistency, not as a new project to excel at, but as a way to stop treating her life like a series of emergencies. Instead of promising herself dramatic changes, she chose small, repeatable actions. She put shoes by the door and walked for a short time after work. She cooked simple meals she could make without a recipe. She kept one evening a week unscheduled, not for productivity, not even for self-improvement, but for quiet. If she didn't know what to do with the time, she sat on the balcony and watched the sky dim over the water. At first, the quiet evening felt uncomfortable. Her mind tried to fill it with plans. She resisted the urge to turn the evening into recovery work. She let it be plain. She washed dishes slowly. She watered her plant. She read a few pages of a book. The point was not to achieve relaxation. The point was to stop chasing intensity as proof that she was alive. The garden group became a gentle anchor. Some weeks Sora went twice, once to help, once to simply sit among the leaves while someone else talked. Sometimes she joined the potluck and brought bought bread, because she didn't have the energy to cook. No one cared. She learned, slowly, that community was not a performance. It was a place where you could arrive as you were. There were still days when her old identity flared up. The part of her that believed worth came from being indispensable. But now, when she felt that familiar pull, she had other voices in her life. Elias would ask how her week had gone, and she could tell the truth. Someone at the garden would mention taking a day off and treating it as normal. The town itself seemed to reinforce the lesson with its slower traffic, its early closing shops, its evenings that belonged to the tide. Over months, Sora's life did not become perfect. It became more breathable. She still worked hard, but she no longer treated exhaustion as a badge. She still had ambitions, but she stopped feeding them with pressure. She began to understand that moving had not failed. It had simply revealed what she needed. A new place could offer space, but she still had to choose how to live in it. And choosing was easier when she wasn't choosing alone. One night, after a potluck that ended with soft laughter and the sound of plates being stacked, Sora walked home with a small container of leftovers balanced in her hands. The street was quiet. The ocean air moved gently around her. She climbed the stairs to her apartment and noticed, with a calm kind of surprise, that she didn't feel the urge to open her laptop. She put the container in the fridge, washed her hands, and turned on a lamp. The day felt complete without being exhausted. When she lay down, she thought about the garden beds, the way growth happened in small increments that were easy to miss until one day, the green was suddenly everywhere. She let that image settle in her mind. She didn't need a dramatic reset. She needed slow, consistent care and the simple comfort of people who would keep showing up with her. With that thought, she allowed the night to be what it was: quiet, ordinary, enough. Each of these lives had a different doorway into exhaustion, and each found a different way back to something softer. One person learned that worth is not a spreadsheet, not a streak, not a row of boxes filled in. Being present, being kind, being human in a room with someone else mattered, even when nothing was produced. Another person learned that attention is a limited resource, and the world will gladly spend it for you if you don't choose. Staying informed can be an act of care, but so can setting a boundary around the night and letting paper pages and warm light replace the endless churn. And another person learned that a change of scenery can offer space, but patterns travel easily. What changed the pace wasn't the address alone, it was community, gentle accountability, and the humble power of doing small things consistently instead of trying to be reinvented in one dramatic leap. If you're listening, while your own mind is still running, you don't have to wrestle it into silence. You can let it slow the way a room grows quiet when the lights are lowered. Notice what is supporting you right now. The mattress under you, the fabric against your skin, the air moving in and out without being managed. Let your jaw unclench if it's been holding. Let your shoulders drop a fraction. Nothing needs to be solved at this hour. You can be someone who rests without earning it. You can care about the world without carrying it through the night. You can change in small, steady ways. With help, without needing to prove anything. For now, the only task is simply to let the day be over. Take one easy breath in and a slower breath out. Allow the next breath to arrive on its own. The night is wide enough to hold you, and you are allowed to drift. Sleep can come when it comes, and you can meet it gently. Good night.